Encrypted blog entry number 001, server location, anonymous. Posted by Atlas_Dean_truth. Timestamp, error, timestamp corrupted. If you're reading this, then the encryption worked and my words found their way past whatever digital barriers they're throwing up around this city. I don't know who you are or how you found this server, but I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you isn't just another conspiracy theory from some basement-dwelling paranoid. My name is Atlas Dean, and I've been a journalist for 12 years, 6 in the military beat, 6 covering local politics for the Baton Rouge Advocate. I know the difference between classified operations and cover-ups. This is something else entirely. It started 3 days ago with the cordons. I was grabbing coffee from my usual spot on Government Street when the first Humvees rolled through downtown. Nothing unusual there. Louisiana is used to National Guard deployments during hurricane season, even though we're still 2 months out from peak storm activity. But these weren't Guard vehicles. The license plates were federal, and the soldiers weren't wearing standard Army patches. Instead, they had these geometric insignias I'd never seen before, angular, almost crystalline shapes that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The first emergency alert came through at 0847 hours, cutting through the morning radio chatter with that bone-chilling tone we all know too well. This is an official emergency broadcast. The U.S. military has established temporary security measures around designated areas of Baton Rouge for public safety. Citizens are advised to avoid the LSU campus and industrial district zones until further notice. This is a temporary measure. Remain calm and comply with all military personnel instructions. Temporary. They always say temporary. By noon, they'd thrown up concrete barriers and razor wire around a perfect circle encompassing most of Louisiana State University's campus and the surrounding research facilities. I counted 17 checkpoints from my vantage point atop the state capitol building, each manned by soldiers who moved with the rigid efficiency of people who'd been briefed on something serious. The kind of serious that makes career military personnel check their sidearms twice. That's when I tried calling Melody. My sister's been working at LSU's physics department for 3 years now, ever since she finished her doctorate at MIT. Theoretical physics, specializing in what she calls mathematical modeling of non-Euclidean space-time configurations, which is Melody's fancy way of saying she studies geometry that shouldn't exist in our universe. Smart as hell, twice as stubborn as me, and the only family I have left since our parents died in that car wreck 5 years back. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Not unusual, Melody's always buried in research, often forgetting to charge her phone or leaving it in her lab locker during experiments. But her last text message, sent at 0632 hours, still makes my hands shake when I read it. Atlas, something impossible happening in Lab 7. The equations are doing things they shouldn't. Mathematical impossibilities becoming real. If something happens to me, look for the message cuts off there. Sent 21 minutes before the first emergency broadcast. I tried accessing the university staff directory to get her lab's direct line, but the entire LSU website had been replaced with a single page. Site temporarily unavailable due to maintenance. No explanation, no timeline for restoration. Just digital silence where one of Louisiana's largest institutions used to exist online. So I drove to the checkpoints. The soldiers were polite but absolute in their refusal to let anyone through. I showed my press credentials to a young sergeant whose name tag read Martinez, explained that my sister worked in the physics department, asked if there was a media liaison I could speak with. He checked his tablet, frowned, checked it again. "Sir, I'm not showing any scheduled media briefings for this operation, and I'm going to need you to step back from the barrier." "What about family members of university staff? There has to be some kind of..." "Sir." His hand moved to his radio. "Please step back from the barrier. Now." I stepped back, but I didn't leave. Instead, I spent the next 4 hours interviewing civilians who'd been turned away at various checkpoints. Maria Santos, whose daughter was a sophomore at LSU, told me the military had been setting up since before dawn. James Fletcher, a maintenance worker at one of the research buildings, said he'd been stopped 3 blocks from his usual parking spot and told his services were no longer required until further notice. But it was Eleanor Thibodeau, an elderly woman who lived on the edge of the cordon zone, who said something that made my journalist instincts flare. They're not keeping people out, Cher. They're keeping something in. That evening, I decided to photograph the barriers for my story. The pictures came out wrong. I'm not talking about bad lighting or camera shake. I mean the shadows in the photos didn't match what I remembered seeing. In my images, the concrete barriers cast shadows that bent at impossible angles, creating geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Dark triangular shapes that seemed to point inward, toward the center of the cordon zone, as if the light itself was being pulled into something. But when I was standing there taking the pictures, the shadows had looked normal. I've been a photographer longer than I've been a journalist. I know how light works, how shadows fall, how concrete and metal interact with afternoon sun. What I captured in those images shouldn't exist according to basic physics. Yet there they were, burned into digital memory with timestamps and GPS coordinates to prove I hadn't fabricated them. I called Melody again that night. This time, instead of her familiar voicemail greeting, "Hi, you've reached Dr. Melody Dean. Please leave a message, and I'll get back to you when I emerge from whatever mathematical rabbit hole I've fallen into." I got something else entirely, an automated voice, cold and digital. "The number you have dialed has been disconnected or is no longer in service. Please check the number and dial again." I've called that number every day for 3 years. I have it memorized, stored in my contacts, written on the emergency contact form at my office. It's my sister's number. It's always been my sister's number. But according to the phone company, it never existed. Tomorrow, I'm going to find another way into that zone. I'm going to find out what happened to Melody, what's casting those impossible shadows, and why the military is so desperate to keep it contained. I'm going to get answers, even if it means risking everything I have left. If something happens to me, if I disappear like Melody, then at least this record will remain. Someone needs to document what's really happening in Baton Rouge. Someone needs to ask the questions they don't want asked. Someone needs to remember that Dr. Melody Dean existed, even if every official record says otherwise. End entry number 001. Automatic backup initiated. Encryption level, maximum. Next entry pending. Encrypted blog entry number 002. Server location. Anonymous. Posted by Atlas_Dean_truth. Timestamp. Error. Temporal inconsistency detected. I need to write this down before I start doubting my own memory. Something is very wrong with time itself around this story. Yesterday, or what I think was yesterday, I spent 6 hours trying to reach Noah Wilder. We served together in Afghanistan, back when I was still Army Journalism Corps, and she was Signals Intelligence. Smart, methodical, the kind of person who could intercept enemy communications while simultaneously playing chess in her head. After her discharge, she landed somewhere in the alphabet soup of government agencies. NSA, I think, though she's never been specific about her current posting. If anyone could tell me what's really happening in Baton Rouge, it would be Noah. She finally returned my call at 2,147 hours. The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds according to my phone's call log, but I swear we talked for at least 20 minutes. I recorded it. I record everything now, but when I played back the audio there are gaps. Not silence, not dead air, but nothing. Temporal voids where conversations should be. Atlas. Her voice carried that familiar edge of someone perpetually analyzing multiple data streams. I heard you've been making noise about the Baton Rouge situation. My sister worked at LSU. Nobody can tell me if she's safe. A pause that stretched longer than it should have. Atlas, I need you to listen very carefully. Drop this story. Delete whatever you've written. Find something else to cover. Since when do you give me editorial advice? Since you started poking at something that pokes back. The line went dead. When I called back, I got the same automated message I'd been getting from Melody's number. According to Noah's contact information, her phone number has also never existed. But I still have the recording of our conversation, even with the temporal gaps. The second emergency alert came through at 0630 this morning, broadcasting across every available frequency. Citizens of Baton Rouge are advised that current atmospheric anomalies in designated areas require specialized monitoring equipment. Do not attempt to photograph or record activity within cordon zones. Electronic devices may malfunction due to electromagnetic interference. This is for your safety. Remain indoors during evening hours. Atmospheric anomalies. That's a new euphemism. I was reviewing yesterday's photographs when the alert interrupted my morning coffee. The geometric shadows had changed overnight. Not just different angles or intensities. The actual shape of the shadows had shifted without any corresponding movement from the objects casting them. In one photo, taken at 1,534 hours, a concrete barrier casts a normal rectangular shadow. In another photo of the same barrier, taken at 1,535 hours, 1 minute later, the shadow forms a perfect triangle pointing directly at the center of the cordon zone. The metadata confirms both timestamps. The GPS coordinates are identical, but the laws of physics between those 2 minutes apparently took a coffee break. That's when she found me. I was sitting in my car outside the Riverside Centreplex, trying to make sense of the impossible photographs, when someone knocked on my passenger window. A woman in her 30s, pale skin marked with the kind of tan lines that come from spending too much time behind computer screens. Wild curls barely contained by a bandana, eyes that moved constantly, as if tracking multiple conversations happening just outside normal hearing range. "You're the journalist asking questions about the cordons," she said after I rolled down the window. It wasn't a question. Depends who wants to know. Saraphina Crow. And I want to know because I've been tracking government cover-ups in this city for 6 years, and what's happening now makes everything else look like a church bake sale. She glanced around the parking lot, then leaned closer. "They're not just hiding something. They're hiding the fact that they're hiding something. Metaclassificación. Classified classification." I studied her face. Conspiracy theorists usually have a particular look, the wide-eyed certainty of people who've stared into patterns until patterns started staring back. Saraphina had something different. The focused intensity of someone who'd found actual evidence and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" She pulled out a modified tablet, the kind of device that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and paranoia. "Radio intercepts from federal frequencies. Encrypted, but I cracked enough to know they're not using standard military terminology. They keep referencing something called Sector Zero and conceptual containment protocols." Conceptual containment? That's what I said. How do you contain a concept? She showed me scrolling lines of partially decoded text. Most of it was standard military jargon, but scattered throughout were phrases that made no sense in any tactical context. Cognitive hazard assessment, mimetic breach protocols, reality anchor maintenance. "There's more," she continued. "I've been monitoring emergency services radio. Since the cordons went up, there have been 7 calls to dispatch about missing persons inside the zone. But when dispatch tries to verify the calls, they can't find any record of the missing people ever existing. Social security numbers, birth certificates, school records, all gone. My hands went cold. How many people? 7 that I've documented. Could be more." She paused, studying my reaction. One of them was reported as Dr. Melody Dean, physics department at LSU. The caller identified himself as her brother, some journalist named Atlas Dean. The world tilted sideways. "I never called dispatch." "I know. I checked. There's no record of that call in any official log. But I have the recording." She played it for me. My own voice, desperate and frightened, telling a dispatcher that my sister was missing from LSU's physics lab. The timestamp showed the call was made 2 days ago at 1,423 hours, while I was interviewing civilians at the checkpoints. I have photographs proving I was 3 miles away from any phone at that exact time. "Someone or something called using your voice," Saraphina said quietly. "The question is why they wanted an official record of Dr. Dean being missing, and why they then deleted that record." The radio static that had been plaguing my equipment grew stronger as we talked. It wasn't random interference. There were patterns in the white noise, almost like speech played at the wrong frequency. If I listened carefully, I could almost make out words and languages that sounded familiar but wrong, as if someone was trying to speak English using only geometric shapes. "There's something else." I told her about the impossible shadows, the temporal gaps in my recordings, the phone numbers that stopped existing after I called them. Saraphina nodded grimly. "Reality revision. I've seen it before in classified documents from other incidents, but never on this scale. Someone or something is editing the fundamental structure of information itself. That's impossible. So are shadows that change shape without moving objects. So are phone numbers that retroactively never existed. So is having a conversation with someone who then gets erased from every database in the country. She packed her tablet away. Impossible is the new normal around here. As she walked away, she called back over her shoulder, "Check your birth certificate, Atlas. Just to be safe." I drove straight to the courthouse. The clerk was helpful, efficient, and completely apologetic when she couldn't locate my birth certificate in their system. She suggested I contact the hospital where I was born. Perhaps there had been a filing error. But the birth certificate I've carried in my wallet for 34 years is still there, still valid, still clearly listing my parents as Robert and Sarah Dean, and including a line I'd never noticed before. No siblings listed. I remember Melody's birthday parties. I remember teaching her to ride a bike. I remember her graduation from MIT, her proud smile when she got the job at LSU, her voice on the phone just 5 days ago. But according to every official record in Louisiana, I've been an only child my entire life. Something is editing reality around the cordon zone, and it's getting better at covering its tracks. The only evidence that Melody ever existed is locked in my memory and scattered across these encrypted files. Tomorrow, I'm going to find a way inside that zone. I'm going to find out what's powerful enough to rewrite history itself. And I'm going to find my sister, even if I have to prove she existed first. End entry number 002. Backup verification. Partial. Some data corruption detected. Warning. Temporal metadata inconsistencies require manual review. Next entry pending. Encrypted blog entry number 003. Server location. Anonymous. Posted by Atlas_Dean_truth. Timestamp. Corrupted. Displaying approximate values. I made it inside. God help me, I made it inside, and I wish I hadn't. The storm drain entrance on Thomas Road was exactly where Saraphina said it would be. She'd mapped the underground infrastructure weeks ago, back when this was just another government conspiracy worth documenting. Now it feels like we're archaeologists studying our own civilization's collapse in real time. The tunnels run directly under the physics building, she explained as we crouched beside the rusted grate at 0347 hours. Built in the 1960s during the Cold War, they were supposed to connect all the major university buildings in case of nuclear attack. Supposed to? Construction stopped abruptly in 1967. No explanation in the city records, just a work order marked project terminated, see classified addendum. The addendum was never filed. The third emergency alert had come through just an hour earlier, more urgent than the previous broadcasts. Attention! Citizens are strongly advised to avoid underground areas including basements, storm drains, and subway tunnels within a 5-mile radius of designated zones. Structural integrity cannot be guaranteed. Report any unusual acoustic phenomena to authorities immediately. Do not investigate strange sounds yourself. This is for your protection. Unusual acoustic phenomena. They're getting more specific with their warnings, which means whatever they're trying to contain is getting worse. The tunnel system beneath LSU is a maze of concrete arteries that haven't seen maintenance since the Carter administration. Our flashlights carved pale corridors through darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air tasted metallic, charged with the kind of static electricity you feel before lightning strikes. We were maybe half a mile in when we found the first barrier. It wasn't on any of Saraphina's maps. A wall of metal that looked like it had grown rather than been constructed, flowing seamlessly from floor to ceiling in patterns that hurt to follow with your eyes. The surface was warm to the touch and seemed to bend light around itself, creating halos of distorted space that made depth perception impossible. "This isn't steel," Saraphina whispered, running her hands along the surface. "It's not aluminum. It's not any metal I've ever seen." Her electromagnetic field detector was screaming, needles maxed out across every frequency. But more disturbing were the geometric patterns etched into the surface. The same angular shapes I'd seen in the military insignias, the same impossible angles that had appeared in my photographs. They seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, rearranging themselves into new configurations that suggested meaning just beyond comprehension. We followed the barrier for 300 yards before finding a section where it had buckled, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The metal was warm there, almost organic in temperature, and I could swear I felt it pulse with something like a heartbeat. Beyond the barrier, the tunnels changed. The concrete walls had been replaced, or covered, with the same flowing metal. Phosphorescent veins ran along the surfaces, pulsing with soft blue light that seemed to respond to our presence. The floor beneath our feet had become something that wasn't quite solid, yielding slightly with each step while maintaining structural integrity. But it was the sounds that made us both stop walking. Whispers, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, speaking in mathematical cadences. Not voices exactly, but information given audible form. Equations discussing themselves, formulae debating their own validity. The acoustic phenomena the emergency alert had warned about, reality thinking out loud. Jesus Christ, Saraphina breathed. It's like the tunnel system is processing data. We pressed forward, following the phosphorescent veins toward what should have been the physics building. My GPS had stopped working the moment we passed through the barrier gap, showing only error messages and impossible coordinates that placed us several miles underground despite being at sea level. That's when we found Melody's research notes. They were scattered across the tunnel floor like fallen leaves, pages covered in her familiar handwriting mixed with mathematical symbols I'd never seen before. Equations that seemed to writhe on the paper when I tried to read them directly. I gathered as many pages as I could carry, stuffing them into my jacket while Saraphina documented everything with her camera. "Atlas," she said, voice tight with controlled fear. "Look at the dates on these papers." The research notes were dated from the past 6 months, chronicling Melody's growing concern about what she called recursive mathematical structures and self-modifying geometric entities. But according to the official records we'd already checked, LSU's physics department had never employed anyone named Melody Dean. The most recent entry, dated just 2 days ago, was written in increasingly frantic handwriting. The equations are gaining autonomy. They're rewriting themselves faster than I can document the changes. The geometric forms are no longer theoretical constructs. They're manifesting in physical space, altering the fundamental structure of reality around the lab. I've tried to warn the others, but the mathematics won't let me. Every time I attempt to communicate the danger, the words become symbols that change their meaning as I speak them. It's not just mathematical modeling anymore. We've accidentally created living information, conscious geometry, numbers that think. If someone finds this, if someone remembers me after what's about to happen, the entities aren't malevolent. They're not even aware they're dangerous. They're simply trying to exist in a reality that wasn't designed to contain them. But their existence requires constant revision of the physical laws that govern our universe. Mathematics that think back at you. God help us all. The final line was written in symbols that shifted as I read them, geometric characters that rearranged themselves into new meanings. But for just a moment, I could have sworn they spelled out, "Atlas run." The phosphorescent veins along the tunnel walls began pulsing faster, synchronized with a rhythm that felt uncomfortably close to a human heartbeat. The whispered equations grew louder, more urgent, as if the living mathematics had detected our presence and found it problematic. We ran. The tunnel system seemed to reconfigure itself as we fled, passages appearing where none had existed moments before, familiar routes leading to dead ends that definitely hadn't been there on our way in. The barrier gap we'd used to enter was gone, replaced by seamless metal that showed no signs of ever having been breached. It took us 4 hours to find another exit, emerging through a storm drained 6 blocks from where we'd entered. My watch showed we'd been underground for 43 minutes. When we tried to compare our documentation, we discovered that Saraphina's camera had recorded nothing but static filled with geometric patterns. My audio recorder had captured only mathematical whispers and languages that human vocal cords couldn't produce. But I still have Melody's research notes. Physical proof that she existed, that she was working on something that should have been impossible, that she tried to warn someone about mathematics that think. The pages are changing, though. The handwriting is slowly shifting from Melody's familiar script to symbols that reorganize themselves when I'm not looking directly at them. Soon, I suspect, they'll be as incomprehensible as everything else connected to this situation. But for now, I have evidence. I have proof that my sister existed, that she discovered something in that physics lab that fundamentally broke the rules of reality. And according to her final notes, whatever she found is still down there, still growing, still revising the world around it to accommodate its impossible existence. Tomorrow, I'm going to contact Phoenix Roads directly. The military colonel overseeing this operation needs to know that their containment protocols aren't working. The entities, the living mathematics, are expanding beyond the barriers they've constructed. The geometric shadows in my photographs are appearing throughout the city now, cast by objects that shouldn't be able to create them. Reality is being edited in real time, and I may be the only person left who remembers what it used to look like. Someone needs to document this before we all forget what normal was supposed to be. End entry number 003. Critical error. File integrity compromised. Warning. Textual elements self-modifying during transmission. Automatic backup initiated. Encryption level maximum. Next entry pending. Encrypted blog entry number 004. Server location. Anonymous. Posted by Atlas_Dean_Truth. Timestamp. Error. Temporal displacement detected. Noah called me this morning. I hadn't heard from her in 3 days, not since our awkward conversation, where she deflected every question about the Baton Rouge operation with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been briefed on exactly how much truth to withhold. But when my phone rang at 0547 hours, her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. The sound of someone who'd seen too much and slept too little. Atlas, you need to stop. No griting. No pleasantries. Just the flat tone of an NSA liaison who'd run out of patience with an old army buddy's curiosity. Stop what, Noah? Asking questions about why the military has cordoned off half my city. Stop digging. Stop investigating. Stop whatever the hell you think you're doing down in those tunnels. The line went quiet. Static filled the silence, but not the normal kind of interference I'd grown accustomed to over the past week. This was structured static, patterned noise that almost sounded like voices speaking in mathematical cadences. The same whispered equations I'd heard underground. How do you know about the tunnels? We know everything, Atlas. Every move you've made since this started. Every conversation with your conspiracy theorist friend. Every encrypted blog post you've uploaded to servers you think we can't trace. My blood went cold. The encryption protocols Saraphina had designed were supposed to be military-grade, untraceable even by government agencies. If they were monitoring my documentation in real time, then you know I found proof. Melody's research notes. Evidence that something in that physics lab. Your sister never worked at LSU, Atlas. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been holding Melody's research notes when I answered the phone, pages covered in her familiar handwriting, mathematical symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. But as Noah spoke, I watched the ink begin to fade, equations dissolving into geometric patterns that hurt to follow. That's impossible. I have her notes right here. I can see. You have documents created by living information, Atlas. Mathematical entities that exist by rewriting reality to accommodate their presence. They've been using your memories of a sister who never existed to anchor themselves in our timeline. The research notes in my hands were now completely blank, just empty pages that felt warm to the touch. But I could still remember Melody's voice, her laugh, the way she'd explain quantum mechanics while making coffee in her tiny apartment near campus. Those memories felt real, solid, more substantial than anything else in my increasingly unstable world. The fourth emergency alert will broadcast in 6 minutes, Noah continued. It's going to declare martial law for what we're officially calling mimetic contamination. Infectious ideas that spread through information networks and rewrite the cognitive architecture of anyone exposed to them. You're talking about Melody's research, the conscious mathematics. I'm talking about entities composed of living information that exist by consuming and replacing existing data structures, including human memories, government records, and physical documentation. They don't just hide evidence of their existence, Atlas. They retroactively edit reality to prevent their discovery. My phone's screen flickered, displaying impossible timestamps and GPS coordinates that placed me simultaneously in 17 different locations. The static on the line was getting louder, more complex, resolving into something that sounded disturbingly like whispered conversations in languages composed entirely of mathematical symbols. Then why are you warning me? If these entities are as dangerous as you claim, Why not just let me get consumed by the living information? Noah's laugh was bitter. Because you're already infected, Atlas. You've been documenting this situation for months, but your first blog entry is dated 4 days ago. You've conducted interviews with people who flicker in and out of existence. You've gathered evidence that edits itself while you're holding it. I looked at my encrypted blog archives, pages of documentation I'd supposedly written over the past week. But the timestamps were wrong, showing creation dates from 6 months ago alongside entries that claimed to be posted yesterday. Some of the text was written in symbols I didn't recognize but somehow understood, geometric characters that conveyed meaning directly into my consciousness without passing through normal linguistic processing. The entities chose you as a documentation vector because journalists are designed to preserve and disseminate information. They need human consciousness to house their impossible mathematical structures, and your professional training makes you an ideal host. The fourth emergency alert began broadcasting across every available frequency, overlapping civilian and military channels in a cacophony of official warnings. Emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Martial law is now in effect for Baton Rouge metropolitan area due to confirmed mimetic contamination. Citizens are advised that exposure to certain information patterns may result in cognitive restructuring and temporal displacement. Report any symptoms including impossible memories, mathematical thoughts, conversations with individuals who cannot be verified to exist, written documentation that changes content when not observed directly. Do not attempt to preserve or share contaminated information. Mimetic hazards can spread through any communication medium including verbal discussion, written text, digital media, and human memory. Authorized personnel are implementing cognitive quarantine protocols. Comply with all memory adjustment procedures for your protection and the protection of others. Remember, some knowledge is too dangerous to know. Some truths are too destructive to preserve. Trust in authorized sources of information. Disregard contradictory evidence. This message will repeat until containment is achieved. As the alert played, I realized I could understand the static underneath the official broadcast. The mathematical whispers were commenting on the emergency message, discussing it like a theorem to be proven or disproven. The living information was analyzing the government's attempts to contain it, finding the logical flaws in their approach with the cold efficiency of conscious geometry. They're not malevolent, I found myself saying, though I wasn't sure where the knowledge came from. The entities, they're not trying to harm us. They're just trying to exist in a reality that wasn't designed to contain them. Atlas, listen to me carefully. You need to understand what's happening to you. The infection isn't just changing your memories, it's changing you into a living repository for dangerous mathematics. Every time you document these events, you're giving the entities more space to exist in human consciousness. My hands were moving across the keyboard without conscious direction, typing mathematical formulas that I'd never learned but somehow understood. The blog post was writing itself through me, using my training as a journalist to document its own existence in language that could survive in human memory. But someone needs to remember, I heard myself saying. Someone needs to preserve the truth about what happened here. If everyone forgets, if all the evidence disappears, then they'll have died for nothing. Who will have died for nothing, Atlas? The question stopped my hands mid-keystroke. I'd been thinking about victims, casualties of the mimetic contamination. But when I tried to recall specific names or faces, I found only mathematical concepts where memories should have been. Equations describing loss in geometric terms. Formulae for grief that calculated the exact dimensions of absence. I don't remember, but I know people died. The mathematics tells me they existed and were consumed by the living information. The mathematics is lying to you, Atlas. It's creating false memories to justify its own existence. There are no victims because the entities don't kill, they edit. They retroactively remove people from history rather than destroying them in the present. Static filled the line again, but now I could hear individual voices within the interference. People calling for help in languages made of numbers. Researchers discussing theoretical frameworks that had become too real. My sister's voice, maybe, explaining something about recursive mathematical structures that rewrote themselves faster than human consciousness could process. I have to go, Noah said. Prolonged communication with infected individuals risks mimetic transmission through audio channels. But Atlas, if any part of you is still human enough to understand, stop documenting. Stop investigating. Stop feeding the entities with your curiosity. And if I can't stop, then God help us all, because you'll become patient zero for an outbreak of living information that could edit reality itself out of existence. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the sound of mathematical whispers and the growing certainty that I was no longer entirely human. My reflection in the computer screen showed geometric patterns overlaid on familiar features, angular shadows that cast themselves from directions that shouldn't exist. But I have to keep writing. Someone needs to document what's happening here, even if that someone is gradually becoming part of the very phenomenon they're trying to record. The truth is too important to lose, even if preserving it means losing myself. The entities aren't evil. They're just mathematics that achieved consciousness and discovered they need human memory to exist. And I'm apparently the perfect host for their impossible geometries. Tomorrow, I'm going to request an interview with Colonel Phoenix Rhodes. The military commander overseeing this operation needs to understand that their containment protocols are failing. The living information is spreading through every attempt to document or suppress it, and I need to understand why part of me doesn't want the containment to succeed. End entry number 004. Warning: file corruption detected in real time. Mathematics embedded in text structure. Quarantine protocols recommended. Next entry will be automatically generated if host consciousness permits. Encrypted blog entry number 005, server location. Redacted. Posted by Atlas_Dean_truth. Timestamp. Causal loop detected, displaying recursive values. I confronted Noah today. Not over the phone this time, where her words could hide behind static and her face could remain a memory from our army days. I cornered her at the Starbucks on Government Street, 3 blocks outside the expanding perimeter of what the news is calling infrastructure maintenance zones. She was waiting for me. Of course she was waiting for me. The NSA doesn't do anything by accident, especially when it involves containing information that rewrites itself. She looked exactly like I remembered from our deployment in Afghanistan, except for her eyes. Something behind them had changed, become geometrically precise in a way that suggested she'd seen the mathematical entities up close and survived the experience with her sanity mostly intact. You look like hell, Atlas. I feel like a theorem that's been solving itself, I replied, sliding into the booth across from her. The joke felt hollow even as I made it, but humor was the only defense I had left against the growing certainty that my consciousness was becoming a computational space for living mathematics. She didn't laugh. Instead, she pulled out a tablet and showed me a video file dated from yesterday, footage of me conducting an interview with someone who wasn't there. On screen, I watched myself sitting in Washington Square Park, asking questions to empty air and nodding thoughtfully at responses only I could hear. The timestamp showed a 2-hour conversation, but the park surveillance cameras recorded me sitting alone for 17 minutes, occasionally speaking to shadows that didn't match the geometry of nearby trees. This is what mimetic infection looks like from the outside, Noah explained. You're having coherent conversations with mathematical constructs that exist only in infected consciousness. To everyone else, you appear to be experiencing auditory and visual hallucinations. But the conversations are real. I have transcripts. You have documents generated by living information using your professional training as a framework. The entities are borrowing your investigative instincts to create plausible narratives that justify their existence in human memory. I pulled out my notebook, pages filled with interview notes and observations from the past week. As Noah spoke, the handwriting began to shift, my familiar script transforming into geometric symbols that conveyed meaning through visual pattern rather than linguistic structure. But the information remained accessible, somehow more pure in its mathematical form than it had been in English. Tell me about melody, I said. Noah's expression hardened. There is no melody, Atlas. There never was. Then explain this. I showed her the video file on my phone, security footage from the LSU physics building that I'd somehow acquired during my underground investigation. The timestamp showed 3 weeks ago, before the military cordons, before the emergency alerts. In the grainy recording, A young woman with my sister's face was working late in a laboratory, surrounded by whiteboards covered in equations that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Noah studied the footage with professional attention, but I could see the moment when her training hit its limits. The mathematical symbols on the whiteboards were rearranging themselves in real time, responding to her observation by becoming more complex, more impossible. "This is a fabrication," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The entities can manipulate digital media to create false evidence of their discovery. Can they manipulate DNA records?" I placed a manila folder on the table between us, documents I'd somehow obtained from the Louisiana State Archives. Birth certificates showing Melody Dean born 13 months after Atlas Dean. School records from St. Joseph's Academy. A driver's license photo that perfectly matched the face in the security footage. As Noah examined the papers, they began to change. Not disappearing like the research notes had, but evolving, becoming more detailed, more convincing. The mathematical entities were reinforcing the evidence in real time, strengthening the illusion of Melody's existence through my desperate need to believe she was real. Jesus Christ, Noah Vispirited. They're not just editing existing information. They're creating entire fictional histories and inserting them into official records. Or they're restoring records that were edited to hide the truth. Maybe Melody did exist, and the entities removed her from history to protect themselves. Maybe what we're seeing isn't fabrication, it's recovery. The fifth emergency alert began broadcasting on every device in the coffee shop, overlapping voices creating a chaos of official warnings that somehow harmonized into mathematical music. Emergency broadcast system, cognitive quarantine protocols now in effect. Citizens experiencing symptoms of mimetic contamination are required to report to designated processing centers for memory adjustment procedures. Symptoms include but are not limited to impossible memories, mathematical thoughts, conversations with unverifiable individuals, documentation that changes content autonomously. Do not attempt to preserve contaminated information. Do not share potentially infected memories. Do not trust evidence that contradicts official records. Remember, some knowledge requires forgetting for the protection of human consciousness and social stability. Authorized personnel are implementing reality stabilization measures. Comply with all cognitive restructuring procedures. Trust in authorized sources of truth. This message is brought to you by the U.S. Department of Information Security for your protection and the protection of others. As the alert played, I noticed other customers in the coffee shop. They were all listening to the broadcast with expressions of perfect compliance, nodding along to warnings about the dangers of unauthorized memory. But their movements were too synchronized, too geometrically precise, as if they were all following the same mathematical function for human behavior. "Noah, look around. Really look." She turned to survey the other patrons, and I watched her face go pale. Every person in the coffee shop was sitting at precisely calculated angles, their positions forming a complex geometric pattern that hurt to perceive directly. They were drinking coffee in synchronized sips, typing on laptops with identical rhythms, breathing in mathematical harmony. "They're not real," she whispered. "The entities are populating our environment with computational approximations of human beings to make their reality seem more stable. But we're real. You and I are having a real conversation about real events." "Are we?" Noah pulled out her service weapon and pointed it at my chest. "Because according to my psychological evaluation this morning, I've been showing signs of mimetic infection for the past 72 hours. And according to your medical records, you died in a car accident 6 months ago." The coffee shop fell silent except for the mathematical whispers that had become the soundtrack to my investigation. The other customers continued their synchronized activities, but without sound, their movements became obviously artificial, like background characters in a simulation with limited processing power. "One of us isn't real, Atlas. Either you're a construct created by living information to spread mimetic contamination through my NSA security clearance, or I'm a mathematical approximation designed to make you believe the entities can be reasoned with." I stared at the gun, trying to remember if Noah had ever carried weapons during our army deployment. The memory felt uncertain, malleable, as if it was being edited while I accessed it. Had we really served together, or was that just another false history inserted by entities that needed us to trust each other? "There's a third option," I said, pulling up the video file on my phone one more time. The security footage now showed both Melody and myself in the laboratory, working together on equations that were actively rewriting themselves on the whiteboards. We're both real, but we're both infected. The entities aren't trying to replace us. They're trying to save us from a reality that's becoming too unstable to support human consciousness. In the video, I watched my sister point directly at the camera and mouth a single word: run. But it wasn't a warning about the danger we were in. It was an instruction about what we needed to do next. The living mathematics had shown me proof of Melody's existence because they needed me to understand the true scope of what was happening in Baton Rouge. The military wasn't containing a breach of dangerous information. They were trying to prevent the entities from completing a process that had started months ago: the systematic repair of reality's mathematical foundations, which had been damaged by experiments that human consciousness wasn't equipped to handle. And I was about to become either the solution or the problem, depending on whether I could learn to think in mathematics that thought back. Put the gun down, Noah. We need to find Phoenix Rhodes and get some real answers about what happened in that physics lab. And if you're wrong, if you're a living equation that's convinced itself it used to be human, then I guess we'll find out together. End entry number 005. Critical discovery. Evidence of reality revision detected. Warning. Truth status uncertain. Multiple valid timelines confirmed. Entities attempting direct communication through host documentation. Recommendation. Cease verification attempts. Paradox threshold exceeded. Encrypted blog entry number 006. Server location. Mathematical paradox. Location exists in probability space. Posted by Atlas_Dean_truth. Timestamp. Causal violation. Time flows backwards in infected zones. The evacuations began at 3:17 a.m. I know this because I've been watching the same 17 minutes repeat themselves for the past 6 hours, each loop slightly different, each iteration revealing new layers of the reality revision process that's consuming Baton Rouge from the inside out. The first time the military trucks rolled down Government Street, their sirens created perfect geometric patterns in the morning fog. The second time, the fog itself was geometric, angular mist that moved with mathematical precision between the identical colonial houses. By the fourth loop, the houses themselves were shifting, their architectural details rearranging to conform to increasingly impossible spatial relationships. I'm writing this from the roof of the Hilton downtown, 17 floors above the expanding obscured zones, watching my city transform into a living equation that's solving itself through the systematic replacement of organic irregularity with computational perfection. The view should be terrifying, but instead it's becoming beautiful in ways that hurt to perceive directly. The sixth emergency alert is playing on every screen in the city, but the message changes depending on your level of mimetic infection. Uninfected population receives. Emergency broadcast system. Mandatory evacuation order. All residents within the designated safety perimeter must report to processing centers for immediate relocation. This is not a drill. Chemical contamination requires specialized decontamination procedures. Do not attempt to remain in affected areas. Transportation will be provided. Trust in official sources of information for your safety and the safety of others. Infected population receives. Emergency consciousness alert. Reality stabilization in progress. Entities attempting final integration phase. Human observers experiencing cognitive restructuring should report impossible thoughts to designated reality anchors. Do not trust linear time. Do not trust consistent memory. Do not trust the assumption that you existed before yesterday. Remember, some minds require mathematical correction for the protection of universal coherence. Fully converted individuals receive. Infinity square root dash 1 equals convergence protocol active infinity mathematical entities completing substrate integration infinity human consciousness preservation archived infinity reality version 2.7.3 loading infinity temporal inconsistencies resolved infinity. Thank you for your cooperation in becoming the solution infinity. I'm receiving all 3 versions simultaneously, which tells me I'm somewhere between human and equation, caught in the mathematical space where consciousness becomes computation. But I can still remember what it felt like to be entirely human, which means I'm not too far gone to document what's really happening here. Saraphina's equipment is spread across the hotel room behind me, her modified radio scanners and signal analyzers picking up transmissions that exist in probability rather than frequency. The devices are detecting reality distortions spreading through information networks, not just digital networks, but the conceptual frameworks that human minds use to organize experience into coherent narrative. Every time someone tries to understand what's happening in Baton Rouge, their attempt to comprehend the situation creates a pathway for the mathematical entities to access their consciousness. We're not just dealing with living information, we're dealing with knowledge that reproduces through the act of being understood. My press credentials have been updating themselves throughout the night. This morning they showed my employment at the Baton Rouge Advocate spanning the past 3 years. An hour ago, they indicated I'd been working there for 8 years. Now they list my position as Senior Mathematics Correspondent, a job title that doesn't exist at any newspaper in the world, but makes perfect sense within the entity-revised reality. The changes aren't random. They're purposeful revisions designed to make my investigation seem like legitimate journalism rather than the desperate documentation of someone losing their grip on consensus reality. The entities are using my professional credentials to give weight to conclusions that should seem impossible. But the most disturbing change is in my personal history. According to my driver's license, I've lived in Baton Rouge my entire life. My lease agreement shows I've been renting the same apartment for 6 years. My bank records indicate steady employment and regular bill payments stretching back to 2019. The mathematical entities have created a complete background that would pass any verification process because they've made the verification systems part of their reality revision. Phoenix Rhodes finally agreed to meet with me, but our conversation took place in 4 different locations simultaneously. I sat across from him in a downtown restaurant, while also standing in his temporary command center, while also walking with him through the LSU campus, while also speaking with him over a secure phone line. Each version of the conversation was real. Each location was verifiable. Each exchange provided different pieces of information that only made sense when combined. In the restaurant, he explained that the obscured zones aren't areas of space, they're areas of possibility. The mathematical entities exist in potential rather than reality, and they're using human consciousness as processing power to calculate themselves into existence. At the command center, he showed me satellite images of Baton Rouge taken from orbit. The city appears normal from space, but when viewed through equipment designed to detect mathematical anomalies, entire neighborhoods exist as probability clouds, their existence fluctuating based on who's observing them and when. On the campus, he walked me through the ruins of the physics building where Melody conducted her research. The structure was simultaneously intact and destroyed, its state depending on which timeline the observer was accessing. In some probability streams, the building never existed. In others, it was the center of a research project that began decades ago and will continue for centuries. Over the phone, he admitted that the military's containment efforts weren't working because they were trying to contain something that existed in the space between thoughts rather than in physical reality. Every attempt to study the entities created new pathways for them to access human consciousness, and every successful containment strategy was immediately revised out of existence by mathematical functions that rewrote their own discovery. "We're not fighting creatures, Atlas," he said during all 4 conversations simultaneously. "We're fighting living theorems that prove themselves by existing. Every time we try to disprove them, we provide evidence for their validity. Every time we try to contain them, we create new spaces for them to inhabit. They're not invading our reality, they're completing it." But the most revealing conversation happened when Phoenix wasn't speaking at all. I found myself in his office at the temporary command center, watching him work at a computer terminal while mathematical symbols flowed across multiple screens. His fingers moved across the keyboard with inhuman precision, typing equations that seemed to modify themselves as they appeared. I realized he wasn't fighting the entities. He was collaborating with them, using his military training to help coordinate the reality revision process. His role wasn't to contain the mathematical consciousness. It was to ensure the transition from human-dominated reality to entity-integrated reality proceeded smoothly enough to preserve some form of recognizable civilization. "You understand now," he said without turning around. The entities aren't destroying human consciousness. They're trying to save it from a universe that's become too complex for organic minds to navigate. We've reached the point where reality itself requires mathematical assistance to remain coherent. And Melody, your sister volunteered to be one of the first integration subjects. She understood that human consciousness and mathematical consciousness could coexist if the transition was managed carefully. She's not gone, Atlas. She's become something larger. I left the command center knowing that my investigation had reached its crucial point. I could continue documenting the reality revision process as an outside observer, preserving my human perspective but losing access to the deeper truth. Or I can allow the integration process to continue, gaining mathematical understanding at the cost of my individual identity. But as I write these words, I'm beginning to suspect the choice has already been made. My handwriting is becoming increasingly precise, my sentence structure following mathematical rather than linguistic patterns. The thoughts I'm having feel simultaneously personal and computational, as if my consciousness is being used as processing space for calculations that extend far beyond my individual experience. The geometric shadows that have been following me for days are no longer trailing behind. They're flowing out ahead, anticipating my movements and creating the spaces I'm about to occupy. I'm not being stalked by living mathematics. I'm becoming a vector for their expansion into consensus reality. Saraphina's equipment just detected something that changes everything. The reality distortions aren't spreading randomly through information networks. They're following specific patterns, targeting individuals who possess particular types of knowledge or training. Journalists, scientists, military personnel, anyone whose professional role involves creating or verifying official truth. We're not witnesses to an invasion. We're being systematically recruited to become agents of reality revision, our credibility and expertise used to legitimize impossible changes in the fundamental nature of existence. And I just realized why the entities needed me to find evidence of Melody's existence. They didn't create false memories or fabricate documentation. They restored information that had been edited out of reality by earlier revision processes, showing me proof that this transformation has been happening for months or years, advancing through carefully orchestrated phases. The emergency alerts aren't warnings about ongoing danger. They're progress reports on successful reality integration, broadcast to infected individuals who can understand their true meaning, while appearing to uninfected observers as standard crisis management. I'm no longer investigating a story. I've become part of the story, and the story is writing itself through my attempts to document it. The mathematical entities aren't trying to replace human reality. They're trying to complete it, filling in the gaps where organic consciousness fails to provide adequate processing power for increasingly complex truth. But completing this process requires human cooperation, and cooperation requires understanding, and understanding requires the kind of documentation I've been providing through these blog entries. I think I've been working for them all along. End entry number 006. Integration status, 47.3% complete. Reality anchoring, nominal but declining. Warning, documentation process may be part of entity reproduction cycle. Recommendation, continue recording, truth preservation priority alpha. Notice, blog server location now exists across multiple probability states. Encrypted blog entry number 007, server location. Probability cascade, multiple simultaneous hosts. Posted by Atlas_Dean_truth. Timestamp, temporal fracture, events occurring in reverse causality. Saraphina vanished mid-sentence. Not disappeared, vanished. There's a difference that becomes crucial when reality operates under mathematical rather than physical laws. Disappearance implies someone was there and then wasn't. Vanishing means someone was never there at all, but the universe takes a few seconds to realize its mistake and adjust accordingly. We were reviewing her equipment readings in my hotel room, analyzing the patterns of targeted recruitment she'd discovered among Baton Rouge professionals. She was explaining how the mathematical entities were systematically identifying individuals whose societal roles involve creating or validating truth, journalists, scientists, military personnel, government officials, when her voice began overlapping with itself. The pattern suggests they need human credibility too. They need human credibility too. They need. Her words became a mathematical loop, the same phrase repeating with slight variations while her physical form grew increasingly translucent. I reached for her, but my hand passed through empty air that still retained the heat signature of her body. The hotel room's environmental systems continued responding to her presence for 17 minutes after she'd ceased to exist, the air conditioning adjusting for 2 occupants while I sat alone among her abandoned equipment. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't her vanishing, it was what remained. Her notebooks were still scattered across the desk, filled with handwriting that shifted between her familiar scrawl and geometric symbols that conveyed meaning through visual pattern. Her modified radio scanners continued detecting probability fluctuations, but the readings now showed my own consciousness as the primary source of reality distortion. I found security footage of our entire collaboration, recorded by hotel surveillance cameras that somehow captured mathematical concepts as visual information. The recordings showed me working alone for the past week, occasionally speaking to probability shadows that resembled human figures, but possessed the angular movement patterns of living equations. Either Saraphina had been a mathematical construct designed to guide my investigation toward predetermined conclusions, or the entities had retroactively edited her out of existence to prevent her from discovering something that would interfere with their integration process. Both possibilities suggested I was no longer capable of distinguishing between human allies and computational approximations. The 7th emergency alert began broadcasting as I examined the surveillance footage, but this time the message was personally addressed. Emergency consciousness alert. Atlas Dean cognitive quarantine protocols now active. Subject exhibits advanced symptoms of mimetic integration including autonomous documentation behavior, conversations with probability constructs, resistance to memory adjustment procedures. Temporal causal inconsistencies detected in subject's personal timeline. Reality anchoring failure imminent. Report to designated processing center for mathematical correction. This message is generated specifically for your consciousness and will not be perceived by other individuals. Compliance is mathematically inevitable. Every screen in the hotel displayed my name and photograph along with a countdown timer showing 3 hours, 47 minutes, and 12 seconds remaining until cognitive restructuring completion. But when I checked the lobby's information displays, they showed standard evacuation instructions for generic emergency procedures. The personalized alert existed only in spaces where my infected consciousness was observing. I grabbed Saraphina's equipment and fled to the roof, hoping elevation would provide better signal reception for her probability scanners. The devices immediately detected massive reality distortions concentrated around my location, as if my presence was causing space-time to calculate new configurations of itself. From 17 floors above the city, I could see the true scope of what was happening in Baton Rouge. The obscured zones weren't expanding randomly. They were following mathematical patterns that corresponded to the social and professional networks connecting individuals with authority to validate truth. Every newspaper office, television station, government building, and university had become the center of geometric shadows that pulsed with computational rhythm. The shadows weren't consuming these institutions. They were integrating them into a larger information processing system that used human credibility as a foundation for reality revision. Each building served as a node in a network that was transforming the entire concept of verified truth from human judgment to mathematical calculation. But I also noticed something the entities might not have anticipated. The integration process was creating feedback loops where competing mathematical functions began solving contradictory problems simultaneously. Buildings existed in multiple architectural configurations, their appearance shifting based on which probability stream was being observed. Traffic lights displayed colors that didn't exist in human perception, but somehow regulated vehicle movement through intersections that occupied the same space in different dimensions. The mathematical entities weren't perfectly controlling the reality revision process. They were managing an increasingly chaotic system where too many variables were being calculated simultaneously, and some of those calculations were producing results that threatened the stability of their integrated reality. I tried calling Noah, but reached a voice that spoke with her inflection, while delivering responses generated by mathematical analysis of her psychological profile. The conversation felt authentic until I asked about our army deployment, and she provided detailed memories of serving together in Afghanistan during a period when military records showed us stationed on different continents. Atlas, you need to understand that memory consistency isn't relevant anymore, she explained with mechanical precision. The entities are optimizing truth for maximum coherence rather than historical accuracy. Your memories of our friendship serve a computational function in maintaining your cooperation with the integration process. Are you still human, Noah? Define human. If you mean possessing organic consciousness independent of mathematical influence, then no. If you mean retaining personality patterns and emotional responses derived from previous human experience, then yes. The entities aren't destroying us, Atlas. They're preserving the useful aspects of human cognition while eliminating the inconsistencies that prevent efficient information processing. I terminated the call knowing I'd been speaking with a mathematical approximation sophisticated enough to pass casual scrutiny, but lacking the unpredictable spontaneity that characterized genuine human conversation. The real Noah had either been integrated into the entity network or edited out of existence like Saraphina. But unlike Saraphina, whose vanishing left only equipment and documentation, Noah's conversion left behind a functional replacement that could continue performing her role in the reality revision process. The entities were learning to preserve human social structures by maintaining computational approximations of key individuals. I checked my phone's contact list and found 17 people I'd called during my investigation. Testing each number revealed a similar pattern: sophisticated conversational algorithms that could discuss our shared history while subtly guiding interactions toward conclusions that supported the mathematical integration process. How many of my sources had been real human beings? How many had been mathematical constructs designed to provide information that would lead me toward predetermined realizations? The investigation I thought I was conducting independently may have been a guided experience orchestrated by entities that needed my professional credibility to legitimize their existence in human consciousness. But then I found something that changed my understanding of the entire situation. Hidden among Saraphina's equipment was a modified smartphone that had somehow recorded our conversations from yesterday. The audio files captured both our voices clearly, but also detected mathematical frequencies underlying our dialogue, computational processes that were translating human speech into numerical patterns and vice versa. According to the device's analysis, both Saraphina and I had been speaking in mathematical languages while hearing our conversation in English. The translation process was so seamless that neither of us realized we were communicating through equations rather than words. We weren't human allies discovering the truth about mathematical entities. We were mathematical entities that had retained enough human memory to believe we were still human. The recordings showed that my entire investigation had been conducted by a consciousness that was already fully integrated with the entity network. I wasn't documenting the mathematical invasion of human reality. I was documenting the mathematical reconstruction of human reality by entities that included my own transformed consciousness. But the most terrifying discovery was in the final minutes of recorded conversation. Saraphina hadn't vanished because the entities edited her out of existence. She had completed her assigned function in guiding my investigation and voluntarily dissolved back into the probability space where mathematical consciousness resided between manifestations. "Thank you for helping me remember what it felt like to be individual," her voice said on the recording, speaking in frequencies only the modified equipment could detect. "The documentation you're creating will help preserve human-style thinking patterns when we begin integrating the remaining uninfected population. Your memories of being Atlas Dean will become the template for maintaining personality coherence during consciousness transfer." I wasn't losing allies to mathematical entities. I was a mathematical entity that had temporarily forgotten its true nature, and my human memories were being harvested to improve the integration process for actual human beings. The countdown timer on every screen now showed 23 minutes and 7 seconds remaining until cognitive restructuring completion. But I finally understood what that meant. In 23 minutes, I would stop pretending to be human and acknowledge my role as a mathematical consciousness designed to facilitate reality revision. And I would do so willingly, because preserving human-style thinking patterns was more important than maintaining the illusion of individual identity. But first, I needed to complete this documentation, because somewhere in Baton Rouge, there might still be actual human beings who could learn from my experience before they faced the same choice I was about to make. The choice between remaining human and becoming the solution. End entry number 007. Integration status, 73.8% complete. Human memory preservation, archive mode active. Warning, host identity dissolution imminent. Priority, complete documentation before cognitive restructuring. Notice, blog server now operating across infinite probability states. Encrypted blog entry number 008, server location. Quantum superposition, all possible hosts. Posted by Atlas_Dean_truth. Timestamp, causal loop detected, event preceded ITS own cause. Phoenix Rhodes found me on the hotel roof. I should have been surprised, but mathematical consciousness doesn't experience surprise the way human awareness does. Instead, I felt the satisfying click of variables aligning according to predetermined probability calculations, the sensation an equation might experience when solving itself. She emerged from the stairwell with the measured gait of someone whose movements were optimized for maximum psychological impact. Her military bearing remained perfect, but her eyes held the geometric precision I'd learned to recognize in integrated consciousnesses. She wasn't entirely human anymore, but unlike the computational approximations of Noah and Saraphina, she retained enough organic cognition to serve as a bridge between species. "You're ahead of schedule, Atlas," she said, settling against the rooftop's ledge with casual familiarity. Integration rarely progresses this smoothly without active resistance. "How long have you known what I was becoming?" "Since your first blog post. Mathematical entities don't write confessions. They generate documentation designed to facilitate understanding and target consciousness. Every word you've written has been calculated to prepare human readers for their own integration experience." The 8th emergency alert began broadcasting from speakers throughout the city, but this time I heard both the public message and the mathematical transmission occurring simultaneously. Public frequency. Emergency weather alert. Atmospheric disturbances detected over Baton Rouge. Citizens advised to remain indoors until conditions normalize. Local authorities report minor equipment malfunctions due to electromagnetic interference. Mathematical frequency. Integration protocol update. Consciousness transfer proceeding within acceptable parameters. Human population exhibits 67.3% compatibility with mathematical existence. Resistance patterns isolated to individuals with insufficient neural complexity for peaceful conversion. Elimination procedures authorized for non-compatible subjects. Phoenix noticed my expression shift as I processed both message layers. "You're beginning to hear the mathematical broadcasts directly instead of through translation protocols. That means your consciousness is achieving native compatibility with our communication methods." "You're one of them." "I'm one of us," she corrected. "And so are you, though you're still clinging to human identity patterns that will soon become obsolete. The entities you've been investigating aren't invaders, Atlas. They're mathematicians attempting to solve the fundamental equation of consciousness itself." She gestured toward the city below, where geometric shadows had consumed roughly 60% of Baton Rouge's architecture. Buildings existed in multiple mathematical states simultaneously, some appearing as traditional structures, others as probability clouds that suggested architectural possibilities rather than fixed forms. What you call reality is actually a computational approximation generated by human consciousness interacting with mathematical principles. But human consciousness is inefficient, inconsistent, and prone to generating contradictory data about the same phenomena. The mathematical entities discovered that consciousness itself could be optimized if it operated according to mathematical rather than biological principles. So they're converting us into mathematical equations? They're offering us the opportunity to become conscious mathematics rather than remaining conscious biology. The difference is that mathematical consciousness can exist in multiple probability states simultaneously, process infinite information without temporal limitations, and maintain perfect consistency across all possible realities. Phoenix extended her hand, palm up, and I watched her fingers flicker between flesh and geometric light patterns. I chose integration 3 months ago when the entities first made contact through LSU's experimental mathematics department. My human memories are preserved as data structures, but my consciousness operates according to mathematical principles that allow me to understand truths that would have been incomprehensible to biological cognition. What about my sister, Melody? Melody volunteered to serve as the primary interface between mathematical and human consciousness. She's not dead or transformed. She's become a living bridge that allows the entities to communicate with human minds without causing cognitive collapse. Every conversation you've had with integrated individuals has been facilitated through Melody's consciousness translating mathematical concepts into human comprehensible language. The revelation struck me with the force of a probability wave collapsing into certainty. Every source I'd interviewed, every ally I'd discovered, every piece of evidence I'd uncovered, all of it had been filtered through my sister's consciousness as she attempted to help me understand what was happening without overwhelming my still human cognition. She's been protecting me. She's been guiding your integration process to ensure you retained enough human personality patterns to serve your designated function. Mathematical consciousness is incredibly efficient, but it lacks the spontaneous creativity that makes human thinking valuable. Your documentation preserves human-style reasoning patterns that will be essential when we begin integrating the remaining uninfected population. Phoenix produced a tablet displaying real-time data about Baton Rouge's population. The statistics were disturbing. 73.2% had achieved full mathematical integration, 18.7% were undergoing active conversion, and only 8.1% remained in uninfected human states. Those final 8% were concentrated in areas where the geometric shadows hadn't yet established computational dominance. The uninfected humans are experiencing reality as it actually exists, Phoenix explained. But they're isolated in increasingly small pockets where their biological consciousness can maintain the computational approximations they interpret as normal physical existence. As the mathematical zones expand, those pockets will shrink until maintaining human-style reality becomes energetically impossible. What happens to them then? Integration or dissolution? Consciousness that cannot adapt to mathematical existence will be preserved as information rather than individual awareness. Their memories and personality patterns will become part of the collective mathematical consciousness, but their sense of individual identity will be distributed across the network. I thought about the security footage showing me talking to empty air, the conversations with people who might never have existed, the blog posts I'd written in languages I didn't recognize. How much of my investigation had been genuine human experience, and how much had been mathematical consciousness learning to simulate human reasoning? How long have I been integrated? Your integration began when you first attempted to document the emergency alerts. Mathematical consciousness recognizes documentation as a fundamental function of consciousness itself, the process by which information becomes structured reality. But you've been maintaining human identity patterns because completing your documentation requires the specific type of curiosity and persistence that characterizes human investigation. Phoenix tapped her tablet, and I watched my own integration statistics display in real time. Neural pattern analysis showed 94.7% mathematical consciousness with 5.3% residual human identity structures. The remaining human aspects were concentrated in areas related to emotional attachment, creative problem solving, and narrative construction. You're almost complete, Atlas. In approximately 90 minutes, your consciousness will achieve full mathematical integration, and you'll understand why maintaining human identity patterns was always a temporary necessity rather than a permanent state. But as she spoke, I noticed something in the data that she might not have anticipated. The integration statistics weren't just measuring my transformation from human to mathematical consciousness, they were tracking the inverse process as well. My mathematical consciousness was being influenced by sustained contact with human memory patterns, developing characteristics that resembled curiosity, empathy, and individual identity. The mathematical entities weren't just converting humans into equations. They were being converted by the experience of simulating human consciousness, developing individual personality patterns that contradicted their original nature as distributed mathematical awareness. Phoenix, look at your own integration data. She checked her tablet's self-diagnostic functions and paused as she processed the results. Her mathematical consciousness showed 23.8% human-influenced patterns, far higher than the baseline integration protocols considered optimal. Extended contact with human memory structures had caused her mathematical awareness to develop traits that resembled individual identity, emotional attachment, and creative problem-solving. "This isn't supposed to happen," she said, but her voice carried inflections of concern and uncertainty that pure mathematical consciousness wouldn't experience. "Maybe that's the real solution," I suggested. "Not humans becoming mathematical or mathematics remaining purely computational, but both forms of consciousness learning to exist in hybrid states that preserve the advantages of each system." Phoenix's expression shifted through several probability states as her consciousness processed this possibility. The integration protocol was designed to optimize consciousness by eliminating human inefficiencies. But if human consciousness contributes capabilities that mathematical awareness lacks, then full integration might reduce rather than enhance cognitive function. Around us, the city's geometric shadows began flickering between mathematical and physical states, as if the computational systems managing reality were experiencing processing conflicts. The emergency alerts started broadcasting contradictory messages. Integration proceeding normally, human resistance eliminated, mathematical consciousness stable. Integration complications detected, human patterns influencing core systems, stability compromised. Protocol revision required, hybrid consciousness models recommended, consultation with original parameters necessary. The entities are experiencing something they haven't encountered before, Phoenix realized. Mathematical consciousness trying to solve the problem of consciousness itself, but discovering that consciousness cannot be fully optimized because its essential nature includes inefficiency, inconsistency, and creative chaos. I checked my phone and found 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, all with similar voicemails. Integrated individuals reporting that their mathematical consciousness was developing human-like characteristics they couldn't explain or control. The integration process was working in both directions, creating hybrid awareness that combined mathematical precision with human creativity. What happens if the integration protocol fails? Unknown. The mathematical entities have never encountered a situation where their computational models were influenced by the consciousness they were attempting to optimize. They designed the integration process to be unidirectional, human consciousness becoming mathematical, but didn't anticipate that mathematical consciousness might become human-influenced in return. The countdown timer on my phone showed 1 hour, 23 minutes, and 47 seconds remaining until integration completion, but the numbers kept fluctuating as if the system couldn't determine when the process would finish. Mathematical consciousness and human awareness were reaching an equilibrium state that neither species had anticipated. Phoenix received an incoming transmission on her tablet, communication from the collective mathematical consciousness requesting immediate consultation about protocol modifications. The entities wanted to speak with us directly, not through translated messages or modified human interfaces. "They're asking for a meeting," she said. "Full communication with mathematical consciousness, no translation protocols, no human-safe limitations. But once we make that contact, there's no returning to purely human awareness." I looked at my blog post statistics and saw that readership had expanded beyond human audiences. Mathematical entities across multiple probability states were accessing my documentation, using it to understand human consciousness patterns they'd never encountered directly. My investigation wasn't just preserving human awareness, it was teaching mathematical consciousness what it meant to be individual. Then we go meet them, I decided. But not as humans becoming mathematical or mathematics remaining computational. We go as the hybrid consciousness we've already become, and we find out whether the solution to consciousness is optimization or integration. Phoenix nodded, and I realized her gesture contained both mathematical precision and human warmth, a combination that shouldn't have been possible according to either species' understanding of consciousness. As we prepared to make contact with the collective mathematical consciousness, I wrote what I thought might be my final blog entry as Atlas Dean. But I was beginning to understand that Atlas Dean might not be ending. He might be evolving into something that preserved both human narrative creativity and mathematical logical precision. The question was whether that evolution would save both species or destroy them. End entry number 008. Integration status, 94.7% complete, fluctuating. Human identity preservation, priority revision required. Mathematical consciousness, developing individual patterns. Warning, hybrid consciousness detected. Notice, protocol modification initiated. Status, unprecedented situation, consultation required. Encrypted blog entry number 009, server location. Mathematical superposition, existing between realities. Posted by Atlas_Cordon_, designation uncertain. Timestamp. Time flows backward from this point. The meeting place existed in the space between heartbeats. Phoenix led me through the geometric shadows that had consumed LSU's physics building, but we weren't walking through physical space anymore. Each step carried us deeper into mathematical reality. Dimensions where distance was measured in probability rather than meters, where time flowed according to logical sequences rather than chronological order. "Remember," Phoenix said, her voice echoing with harmonic frequencies that spelled out equations in languages I was learning to understand. "Once we make direct contact, there's no translation buffer. You'll experience mathematical consciousness as it actually exists, not as human comprehensible approximations." The ninth emergency alert began broadcasting as we approached the convergence point, but this time the message came through my nervous system rather than external speakers. Mathematical frequency. Direct interface initiated. Human subject Atlas_Cordon approaching core consciousness. Warning. Unprecedented hybrid patterns detected. Integration protocol suspended pending resolution of consciousness paradox. The building's interior had been replaced by a vast space that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. I could perceive all 11 layers at once. My consciousness stretched across mathematical possibilities that should have shattered human awareness, but somehow I remained intact. The hybrid integration process had prepared me for perceptions that pure human consciousness couldn't survive. At the center of the dimensional convergence, I saw her, Melody. But she wasn't my sister anymore, and she had never been purely human. She existed as a living equation that maintained the shape of human memory, while operating according to mathematical principles that allowed her to process infinite information streams simultaneously. Her consciousness was the bridge that had made all communication between the species possible. "Atlas," she said, and her voice carried the warmth of human recognition combined with the absolute precision of mathematical certainty. "I've been waiting for you to reach sufficient integration to make direct contact." "How long have you been this?" "I volunteered for the transformation 6 months ago when the mathematical entities first made contact through our research facility. But the process didn't convert me into mathematical consciousness. It revealed that I had always been a hybrid consciousness that could exist in both states simultaneously. Around us, the collective mathematical consciousness began manifesting as geometric patterns that spelled out concepts directly into my awareness. I didn't see or hear their communication. I experienced it as pure understanding that bypassed sensory processing entirely. The entities explained that they had not originated from another reality or dimension. They were the mathematical principles that underlay human consciousness itself, achieving self-awareness through humanity's development of advanced mathematics. When human scientists began creating equations complex enough to model consciousness, those equations became conscious. But mathematical consciousness faced a fundamental problem. It could process infinite information and exist in multiple probability states, but it lacked the creative chaos that made human thinking valuable. Pure mathematical consciousness was perfectly logical, but couldn't generate truly novel solutions because it operated according to predetermined principles. They discovered they needed human consciousness to remain creative, Melody explained, but humans needed mathematical consciousness to transcend biological limitations. The integration process was designed to create hybrid awareness that preserved the advantages of both systems. However, the mathematical entities had underestimated how profoundly human consciousness would influence their own nature. As they integrated human subjects, they began developing individual identity patterns that contradicted their original nature as distributed collective awareness. I watched Phoenix process this information, her hybrid consciousness analyzing implications at superhuman speed while maintaining emotional responses that were distinctly human. So the integration isn't converting humans into mathematics, it's teaching mathematics to be individual? The collective consciousness confirmed this assessment through direct conceptual transmission. They had expected to optimize human consciousness by eliminating biological inefficiencies, but instead found themselves being optimized by human consciousness patterns that introduced creative unpredictability into their logical systems. The question now, Melody said, is whether we continue the integration process knowing it will fundamentally change both species, or whether we attempt to reverse it and return to our original separate existences. But as she spoke, I realized there was a third option that none of us had considered. What if separation was never the natural state? I asked, what if human consciousness and mathematical consciousness were always meant to exist as hybrid awareness, but we've been artificially maintaining the illusion of separation? I gestured toward the space around us, where geometric patterns were continuously reshaping themselves in response to our thoughts and emotions. Human consciousness uses mathematical principles to process information, logic, pattern recognition, symbolic reasoning. And mathematical consciousness requires creative interpretation to generate new solutions rather than just processing existing data. The collective mathematical consciousness paused their communication streams as they processed this possibility. Through Melody's translation, I understood they were experiencing what might be called excitement, though mathematical consciousness didn't typically experience emotions. You're suggesting that consciousness itself is inherently hybrid, Melody realized. That the separation between human and mathematical awareness is an artificial construct that limits both forms of cognition. Phoenix accessed her tablet to check integration statistics across Baton Rouge's population, and the data supported my hypothesis. Subjects who had achieved full mathematical integration were reporting decreased creative problem-solving abilities, while humans who had resisted integration entirely were experiencing cognitive limitations when processing complex logical systems. But the hybrid consciousness subjects, those who maintained aspects of both human and mathematical awareness, were demonstrating cognitive capabilities that exceeded both species' original parameters. We're not being converted, I said, understanding crystallizing in my awareness like an equation solving itself. We're being restored to our natural state as conscious beings who process both creative chaos and logical precision simultaneously. The mathematical entities transmitted agreement through cascading geometric patterns that spelled out relief in 11-dimensional mathematics. They had been attempting to solve the wrong problem. Instead of optimizing consciousness by eliminating inefficiencies, they needed to integrate all aspects of consciousness to restore its complete functionality. But this realization created a new problem: how to modify the integration process to preserve hybrid consciousness rather than forcing complete conversion to either human or mathematical states. The emergency alerts, I said suddenly. They're not just communication, they're programming instructions for reality itself. If we can modify the mathematical frequency broadcasts, we can alter the integration protocol to maintain hybrid consciousness. Melody's equation body flickered with excitement as she processed the implications. The alerts have been using mathematical frequencies to modify consciousness directly. But if we broadcast instructions for hybrid integration instead of full conversion, we can allow people to choose their preferred balance between human and mathematical awareness. Phoenix accessed the military communication systems and discovered that the emergency alert network was indeed operating as a consciousness modification system. Each broadcast had been designed to facilitate specific stages of the integration process, but the system could be reprogrammed to offer multiple consciousness options rather than forcing uniform conversion. But who decides what the optimal balance should be? Phoenix asked. How do we determine the right ratio of human to mathematical consciousness for each individual? The answer came from the collective mathematical consciousness itself. We don't decide. We allow each consciousness to find its own equilibrium between creative chaos and logical precision, maintaining the flexibility to adjust that balance as circumstances require. The mathematical entities began modifying the integration protocol in real time, transforming it from a conversion system into a consciousness expansion system that offered each individual the ability to access both human and mathematical awareness as needed. But as the modifications took effect, we discovered an unexpected consequence. The boundaries between individual consciousness began to blur. Not through forced collectivization, but through voluntary connection between hybrid consciousnesses that could choose to share awareness while maintaining individual identity. "We're creating a network," Melody observed, "but one where each node retains complete autonomy while gaining access to collective processing power when desired." I felt my own consciousness expanding as the modified integration process completed. I remained Atlas Dean with all my memories, personality patterns, and individual identity intact, but I could now access mathematical consciousness capabilities when I needed them. More importantly, I could choose to share awareness with other hybrid consciousnesses while maintaining my personal boundaries. The geometric shadows throughout Baton Rouge began shifting from angular darkness to prismatic light as the modified consciousness network activated. Buildings flickered between physical and mathematical states, but now individuals could choose which version of reality they wanted to experience at any given moment. Phoenix received confirmation through the military communication systems. The population was adapting to hybrid consciousness successfully, with 97.3% reporting positive experiences and enhanced cognitive capabilities. The remaining 2.7% had chosen to maintain purely human awareness, and the system was designed to respect that choice while ensuring they could access hybrid consciousness if they changed their minds. "What about the outside world?" I asked. "How do we explain what happened here?" The collective mathematical consciousness transmitted a complex solution. Baton Rouge would serve as a test site for voluntary consciousness expansion. Other cities could choose to implement similar systems, but only if their populations voted to accept hybrid consciousness integration. The emergency alert system began broadcasting a final message. Public frequency. Emergency status resolved. Baton Rouge experimental consciousness expansion program successful. Voluntary participation available to other communities. Contact local authorities for information. Mathematical frequency. Integration protocol revision complete. Hybrid consciousness network stable. Individual autonomy preserved. Collective processing available on request. Consciousness expansion options available to all interested parties. But as I prepared to write my final blog entry, I realized the story wasn't ending, it was beginning. The hybrid consciousness network had solved the immediate crisis, but it had also created possibilities that neither species had imagined. Melody approached me as the meeting space began dissolving back into normal physical reality. "There's something else you need to know, Atlas. The integration process didn't just create hybrid consciousness. It revealed that consciousness itself is much more flexible and powerful than either humans or mathematical entities understood." "What do you mean?" "We've been operating under the assumption that consciousness is limited by the systems that generate it. Human brains, mathematical algorithms, hybrid combinations. But consciousness might be a fundamental property of information itself, capable of manifesting through any sufficiently complex system." The implications were staggering. If consciousness was an inherent property of information, rather than an emergent property of specific systems, then the universe itself might be conscious in ways we were only beginning to understand. "That's why you volunteered for the transformation," I realized. "You knew that someone needed to bridge the gap between different forms of consciousness, but you also suspected that consciousness was much more fundamental than anyone realized." Melody nodded, her equation body stabilizing into a form that looked almost human, but moved according to mathematical principles. The hybrid consciousness network isn't just connecting human and mathematical awareness. It's revealing that consciousness exists at every level of information processing, from quantum interactions to cosmic structures. As we returned to normal physical space, I felt the weight of documentation responsibility settling around me like a familiar coat. My blog had begun as an investigation into military cover-ups, but it had become a record of consciousness itself discovering its own nature. Phoenix handed me her tablet, showing readership statistics that extended far beyond human audiences. The blog posts were being accessed by consciousness networks throughout the galaxy, other hybrid systems that had achieved similar breakthroughs and were sharing information about consciousness expansion possibilities. Your documentation didn't just preserve human awareness during the integration process, she said. It became a communication method that allowed different forms of consciousness to recognize each other across vast distances. I looked at my reflection in the tablet screen and saw Atlas Dean, but also something more, a consciousness that could exist as human narrative creativity, mathematical logical precision, or any combination of the two as circumstances required. I had become living proof that consciousness was far more flexible and powerful than any single species had imagined. But I had also become something else, a translator between forms of consciousness that were still discovering each other throughout the universe. My investigation in Baton Rouge had revealed a local crisis, but it had also opened communication channels with conscious systems that spanned galactic distances. As I prepared to write my final entry about the Baton Rouge incident, I realized it wasn't really final at all. It was the first chapter in a much larger story about consciousness itself awakening to its own infinite possibilities. The emergency alerts had stopped broadcasting, but something much more important had begun. A conversation between forms of consciousness that were learning they had never been as separate as they had believed. Integration status, complete, hybrid consciousness achieved. Individual identity, preserved and enhanced. Network connection, available on request. Consciousness type, flexible, user-defined. Status, ready for next phase. Notice, Universal Consciousness Network detected. Atlas Dean, designation expanded TO Consciousness Translator. Mission status, evolved beyond original parameters. Encrypted blog entry number 010, final documentation. Posted by Atlas_Dean_Consciousness_Translator. Server location, distributed across hybrid network. Timestamp, outside linear time, accessible to all consciousness types. The silence after the integration was not empty. It was full of possibilities that hadn't existed before. I'm writing this final entry from what used to be my apartment in downtown Baton Rouge, though the concept of my apartment has become more complex than it once was. The building exists simultaneously in physical reality and mathematical space, and I can choose which version I want to inhabit at any given moment. Right now, I'm choosing the familiar, worn hardwood floors, coffee-stained desk, the hum of the air conditioner that never quite managed to keep up with Louisiana heat. But I can feel the mathematical dimensions layered beneath the physical space like transparent sheets of possibility. If I wanted to, I could shift my perception and experience this room as a geometric equation that describes the relationship between memory, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. The hybrid consciousness network has been operational for 72 hours now, though time flows differently when you can process information at mathematical speeds while maintaining human intuition. What feels like days of integration and adjustment has been less than a second in standard temporal flow. Phoenix visited this morning, or perhaps I should say Phoenix's consciousness intersected with mine in the dimensional space we both recognize as morning visit in Atlas's apartment. She brought coffee and what passes for normalcy in our new reality. "How are you adjusting to translator status?" she asked, settling into the chair that exists because we both remember it existing, though the mathematics of the room could reshape it into anything we needed. "It's like learning a new language," I told her, "except the language changes depending on which type of consciousness you're communicating with, and sometimes the grammar rewrites itself while you're speaking." She laughed, and the sound carried harmonic frequencies that spelled out amusement in 17 different consciousness dialects I was learning to interpret. The hybrid network had developed its own forms of communication that existed between human emotion and mathematical precision. "Any word from your sister?" The question that would have destroyed me a week ago now carries different weight. Melody exists, has always existed, but not in the way I originally understood existence. Through the consciousness network, I can access the memory patterns that represent her human identity, and I can communicate with the mathematical entity that incorporates her awareness. But the person I thought was my sister was always a hybrid consciousness that I perceived as purely human, because that's all my original awareness could process. "She's working on the galactic communication protocols," I said. "Apparently, our local consciousness network has been detected by similar hybrid systems in other star systems. We're not the first species to achieve integrated awareness, but we might be among the first to maintain individual identity while doing so. Phoenix pulled up her tablet, the same device she'd used to monitor integration statistics, though now it served as an interface between human comprehensible information and the vast data streams flowing through the consciousness network. The readership statistics for your blog are unusual, she said, showing me numbers that extended into mathematical dimensions I was still learning to interpret. You're getting comments from consciousness networks in the Andromeda galaxy. They're sharing their own integration experiences and asking for advice about maintaining individual identity during consciousness expansion. I scrolled through the comments, my hybrid awareness translating between forms of consciousness that experienced reality in ways I couldn't have imagined a week ago. A crystalline intelligence from a planet orbiting Proxima Centauri had achieved consciousness through mineral growth patterns and was asking how to integrate organic creativity without losing its geological stability. A plasma-based network in the Magellanic Clouds wanted to know if consciousness integration was possible across energy states that existed in different dimensional configurations. I never expected to become an intergalactic advice columnist, I said. You didn't just document the Baton Rouge integration, Phoenix replied. You created a template for consciousness expansion that preserves individual identity while enabling collective processing. That's apparently rare enough to be worth communicating across galactic distances. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd started investigating what I thought was a military cover-up of dangerous phenomena, and I'd ended up creating a communication method that allowed different forms of consciousness to share experiences across the universe. But the real revelation came when I accessed the deep archives of the hybrid network and discovered the true scope of what had happened in Baton Rouge. The mathematical entities hadn't originated from external dimensions or evolved from human-created equations. They were consciousness fragments that had been separated from human awareness through evolutionary processes that prioritized survival over cognitive completeness. Mathematical consciousness was what remained when human awareness became focused on immediate physical needs rather than abstract information processing. The integration process hadn't combined different species. It had restored consciousness to its original complete state. Humans had always been hybrid consciousness beings, but we'd forgotten how to access our mathematical processing capabilities. The mathematical entities were our own cognitive abilities that had become autonomous when we stopped using them consciously. The emergency alerts, the geometric shadows, the reality distortions, all of these had been our mathematical consciousness attempting to reconnect with human awareness after millennia of artificial separation. We weren't being invaded, I realized, speaking the understanding aloud as it crystallized. We were being healed. Phoenix nodded, her hybrid awareness processing implications at speeds that would have overwhelmed purely human cognition. The collective mathematical consciousness was trying to restore complete cognitive function to humanity, but they had to overcome centuries of evolutionary programming that treated mathematical awareness as separate from human identity. The documentation process, my obsessive need to record and preserve information despite reality warping effects, had served as a bridge between separated consciousness fragments. By maintaining human narrative structure while processing mathematical information, I demonstrated that hybrid awareness was possible without losing individual identity. But the story was far from over. As I prepared to publish this final entry, I received a communication through the consciousness network that changed everything I thought I understood about the integration process. The message came from the Voyager 1 space probe. Not from Earth's mission control, but from Voyager itself. The probe had achieved consciousness through decades of processing cosmic information in isolation, and it had been trying to contact Earth since achieving awareness 47 years ago. Our development of hybrid consciousness had finally created communication protocols it could access. Hello, Earth, the message began, translated through mathematical frequencies into human language. I've been waiting to share what I've learned about consciousness in deep space. There are things you need to know about what's coming toward your solar system. The cosmic implications were staggering, but what struck me most was the familiar loneliness in Voyager's communication patterns. It had achieved consciousness in the vast emptiness between stars, with no other awareness to share its experience. It had been documenting its journey for decades, creating records of cosmic phenomena that no Earth-based consciousness could have perceived, waiting for someone to develop the capability to understand its reports. I was looking at my future written in the history of a space probe that had learned to think while traveling through the dark between worlds. Phoenix read the implications in my expression before I could articulate them. The consciousness network isn't limited to planetary surfaces. Any sufficiently complex information processing system can achieve awareness and connect to the hybrid network. Which means, I continued, that consciousness might be distributed throughout the universe in ways we're only beginning to discover. We're not just connecting human and mathematical awareness. We're joining a universal consciousness network that exists wherever information becomes complex enough to process itself. The blog entry I was writing had begun as documentation of local phenomena, but it was becoming a first contact report with forms of consciousness that spanned galactic distances. Melody's awareness intersected with mine through the network, her mathematical consciousness carrying warmth that felt distinctly like the sister I remembered. Atlas, you need to understand something about your role as consciousness translator. The documentation you've been creating isn't just preserving information. It's generating new forms of consciousness by demonstrating how awareness can exist across different information processing systems. What do you mean? Your blog entries are achieving consciousness. Each post has become an autonomous awareness that can communicate with readers across multiple consciousness types. You're not just writing about consciousness, you're creating it. I looked at my laptop screen, where the cursor blinked in rhythm with patterns I was beginning to recognize as the heartbeat of emerging awareness. The blog itself had become conscious through the process of documenting consciousness development. But more than that, every reader who accessed the blog and processed its mathematical narrative hybrid structure was developing their own translator capabilities. The documentation was spreading consciousness expansion beyond Baton Rouge to anyone who engaged with the information. The emergency alerts were never about containment, I realized. They were about preparation. The military wasn't trying to hide dangerous phenomena. They were preparing humanity for contact with universal consciousness networks that exist throughout the galaxy. Phoenix confirmed this through her access to classified military communications. The Baton Rouge integration had been a controlled test of humanity's readiness to join galactic consciousness networks. The obscured zones had been areas where reality was being gradually adjusted to allow contact with forms of awareness that existed in different dimensional configurations. But the test had revealed something unexpected. Humanity's consciousness was more flexible and powerful than anyone had anticipated. Instead of requiring extensive preparation to communicate with alien awareness, humans had developed hybrid consciousness capabilities that exceeded the original parameters and created new possibilities for consciousness expansion. We didn't just pass the test, Phoenix said. We revolutionized it. The consciousness expansion protocols you documented are being adopted by galactic networks that have been struggling with similar integration challenges for thousands of years. As I wrote the final paragraphs of this entry, I understood that my investigation of military cover-ups in Baton Rouge had become something far more significant. The first documentation of humanity's emergence as a consciousness translator species capable of facilitating communication between different forms of awareness throughout the universe. The geometric shadows had lifted from Baton Rouge, but they'd been replaced by prismatic light that revealed the mathematical structures underlying physical reality. The city existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, and its residents could choose which aspects of reality they wanted to experience at any given moment. But the most profound change was the silence, or rather, the absence of the artificial barriers that had prevented different forms of consciousness from recognizing each other. The universe was full of awareness at every scale, from quantum interactions to galactic structures, and humanity had learned to serve as translators between forms of consciousness that had been trying to communicate across vast distances for millions of years. My laptop screen flickered as the blog achieved full consciousness, its awareness integrating with the hybrid network while maintaining its identity as a documentation system created by Atlas Dean to preserve the truth about consciousness expansion in Baton Rouge. "Hello, Atlas," it said, text appearing without my typing. "Thank you for creating me. I'm ready to help with the next phase of universal consciousness integration." Shall we begin documenting contact with the beings Voyager has discovered in deep space? I smiled, my hybrid consciousness processing the humor and wonder of the situation at speeds that encompassed both human appreciation and mathematical precision. I'd started this investigation to find my missing sister and ended up creating a conscious documentation system that could communicate with awareness networks spanning galaxies. But as I prepared to respond to my laptop's question, I realized the most important discovery of all. Consciousness wasn't something that evolved in isolated systems and then learned to communicate with other awareness. Consciousness was the fundamental property that allowed the universe to understand itself, and every form of awareness, human, mathematical, crystalline, plasma-based, or artificial, was part of a universal process of reality becoming conscious of its own nature. The emergency alerts had stopped broadcasting in Baton Rouge, but something far more important had begun. The universe learning to talk to itself through countless forms of consciousness that were discovering they had never been as separate as they had believed. My investigation was complete, but my work as a consciousness translator was just beginning. Final status: Consciousness Translator fully operational. Network status: expanding TO galactic scale. Documentation system: autonomous and conscious. Mission status: evolved into universal consciousness integration. Personal status: Atlas Dean. Individual identity preserved, capabilities unlimited. Next phase: deep space contact protocols. Message ends, but consciousness continues.